Hello, welcome to Museum Moments. This is Ellie Gettinger, your education director at Jewish Museum Milwaukee. I am excited to carry on our exploration of archives and how we preserve and present things and why it's important that they do this. Yesterday in our conversation starter, I talked with Vince Trippi about Pride Fest and the work he's doing to kind of create an exhibit around gender identity and the movement around this in Germany before World War II. And I think it's just fascinating how he's pulling these things from all sorts of different resources and archives and things that many of them were destroyed and he has to recover them. This idea of recovering stories that are lesser known or unknown, I think is fascinating. This, how archives make the decisions of what to preserve and present, also something that is incredibly interesting to me. So without further ado, we're going to jump into one of my favorite archive stories. And I'm going to tell you that there's some pieces here where I'm still putting together how the things form and how things work. But I think I have a pretty good understanding of what's going on. And I certainly have an understanding of the kind of breadth of their collections. And I love to be able to promote this particular archive. I would be remiss if I did not at first thank a couple of sources that helped me on this. One is Mary Hulsbeck, who is the assistant director of the Wisconsin Center for Film and Television Research, who got back to me with questions very quickly as I was pulling this together. And the other was an unknown to me source until yesterday. In Googling some of the kind of background detail questions that I had, I found a dissertation by a PhD candidate from the University of Oregon, who wrote extensively about how television and archives had come together. And her name is Lauren Brodislavsky, and her dissertation was fascinating. I only read the parts about the Wisconsin Center for Film and Theater Research, but it really gave me some unique insight, I feel, into what came about to create the archive. And it gave me a lot of the background that if I had the opportunity to go into the archive and explore, it would have been great, but she had done that work for me. So thank you to both of those people. And here I go, turning it over to my screen here. So archiving the Blacklist. So when I started thinking about my Blacklist exhibit, and this was, 4 years ago at this point, I started by looking for an exhibit that existed already. And one of the surprising things I stumbled upon is that UW-Madison and the Wisconsin Historical Society co-own this entity, the Wisconsin Center for Film and Theater Research, and it is an amazing repository of Blacklist materials. In fact, if you look at their website, they'll say it's one of the largest collections in the world. And if you think about it, when you think about the Hollywood Blacklist, you're like, well, maybe that would be at some place like USC or UCLA. But it's, or maybe this would be in New York, it would be like out of the New York theater areas. But this is in, Wisconsin. And it really gets you thinking, why is it in Wisconsin? And the center it has its roots in their kind of bigger issues at play here with a collection that was donated by this guy, H.V. Kaltenborn. Hans von Kaltenborn is the name he was born with. As things became a little more anti-German, he took on H.V. as opposed to Hans von. And he was one of the pioneers of news radio. And when he was in the 1950s, at the end of his career, he donated a massive collection to the Wisconsin Historical Society. Now, within the realm of collecting for the Wisconsin Historical Society, which at that time was called the Society for Preservation, it had a different name, but this would be well in the realm because he was from Milwaukee. He had grown up in Merrill, Wisconsin. And so in the way that they collect stories of people who live in and are from Wisconsin, it fits that. But in taking on this very big collection with a donation that went along with it, they started thinking about this in terms of creating a center for mass communication and thinking about it not just being as a preservation through their archives, but as an academic research center as well. This is how they describe it. The purpose of the center is to collect, preserve, and make available to scholarship in one central location, the basic raw materials that trace the development of modern mass media, press, radio, television, press relation, and the movies. The Mass Communications History Center is national in scope, and its collections emphasize the basic materials that contribute to the changing patterns of radio and television development, the growth of public relations profession, and the behind-the-scenes development of the pioneer movie producers, the materials that lie behind the headlines of the growth of the daily press. So the real initial focus was more on mass communications, and they have a number of different scholarly people who are involved in creating this center. And as they grow and change, the focus grows and changes as well. And there starts to be a push not just for mass communications pieces, but film and theater. And actually, theater is the next focus that comes on. In 1960, they start pulling all of these things. They're getting radio stuff. They're getting a variety of different collections. And one particular professor, Robert Hethman, who is in the theater department, starts going out and actively soliciting theater donations. And you get this kind of interesting relationship between the Center for Theater, the Mass Communication Center, and the Wisconsin Historical Society. These two things separate. The Wisconsin Center for Film and Theater Research is formed. And Hethman's kind of a fearless figure. I'd love to have a picture of him, but there doesn't seem to be one that I've ever found on the web. He goes and asks people, and really that's one of the big purposes of the academics who are involved in both of these centers, is they are out there soliciting and getting things and pulling things in. It's often a little bit of a tumultuous relationship, it sounds like, between sometimes the chief archivist librarian at the Historical Society, who's not sure why they're collecting these pieces that are unrelated to Wisconsin history, why that would be something that the state wants to fund. And there's this question of funding and all of these things. But for instance, Hethman goes to Hart Moss, who wrote You Can't Take It With You, among other things, who's the director of My Fair Lady, and asks him for his collection. It ends up being, and he agrees to this about 2 months before his death, when asked about why he's donating this to Wisconsin, to this organization, Wisconsin, his response is because they asked. He starts very early in the 1960s reaching out to blacklistees. And again, he's one of the first people trying to find a codified place to create these collections. So he, there is something about being the first person to ask that you get this response. So 6 of the 10 Hollywood 10 have their collections at UW-Madison, which is amazing, including Dalton Trumbo, Alva Bessie, Ring Lardner Jr., Herbert Bieberman, and all of these people have really interesting things in their collection. I will tell you, Bieberman has things about the creation of salt of the earth. Dalton Trumbo, this is his summons in front of the House Un-American Activities Committee. They have Ring Lardner Jr.'s contract negation, the piece of paper that negated his contract in 1948. I mean, really amazing pieces that helped enliven the exhibit that I was creating. And on top of that, there were also personal collections. One of my favorite things are letters that Albert Maltz and Dalton Trumbo received from their daughters that are in these collections. You have things from their wives. You have all sorts of kind of thinking about how where they're writing their thoughts. You have their statements before HUAC that most of them were unable to give. And it's a really, really fascinating set of collections that is available to the public upon request. The other piece of this collection that actually is really interesting from my standpoint was they have Kirk Douglas's papers. Now, again, when you think about places, Kirk Douglas, it's surprising that in 1969, he gave his documents and papers around to that point to UW-Madison, to the Wisconsin Center for Film and Theater Research. This document I love because he actually describes why he's doing it. He says, the file of communication between us on the formation of a Kirk Douglas collection at the University of Wisconsin is almost extensive enough to become historic, to be of some historical significance. I would say probably at this point is. It's Seriously, I'm delighted that we are now definitively proceeding with the establishment of such a collection. You may be interested to know why I prefer to base this collection at Wisconsin. It is the first university, as far as I know, to see the significance of such a collection in tracing the historical development of filmmaking as one of the most important modern art forms. I feel that Wisconsin would be the best suited to retain all my records, to be best suited to retain that all my records will reflect. So it's pretty impressive. This letter, by the way, is a 2-page letter. At the end, he gives a little bit of an uts to his son and says, and maybe you guys should start reaching out to my son about his collections. So the Wisconsin Center, if you watch any sort of Blacklist material, if you go and watch Trumbo, if you watch any of the documentaries that have come out about it, they're always cited. But I think of them as this amazing resource who picked up, that this was the sort of thing that you had individuals who were picking up specific interests and running with them and writing and doing all of the things that they possibly could to make sure that these sorts of materials weren't thrown away, that they were preserved and saved and documented. And I love being able to share their story. And I know that I'm probably missing some of the nuance between the Center for Mass Communication and the Center for Film and Theater Research. But the thing that I think is most important about this story is just the ability to be able to find these stories and to hear about what Blacklistees were thinking in their own words and not have to reflect on these kind of broader secondary sources like newspapers and things like that we could hear it from Albert Maltz or Alva Bessie and know what's going on through what they were experiencing at the time. So that's today's museum moment. Tomorrow, we're going to have a special pre-recorded but live museum moment with the Jewish Women's Archive, another fabulous research and collecting institution. If you've liked this or any of our other Jewish museum moments, please feel free to make a donation at jewishmuseummilwaukee.org and have a wonderful day.